Welcome. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you might be. I'm Eric Schumacher Rasmussen. I'm the editor and VP of Streaming Media and the conference chair for another Streaming Media Connect. Thanks so much for taking time out of your day to join us as we go through another week full of panels and presentations on everything from very technical topics like encoding and ATSC 3.0 to broader business and strategy based topics like the one we're going to talk about today in the next hour. We'll also have a session later on this afternoon about the complicated world of advertising technology. And next week, we're going to have a week full of in-depth panels from streaming media contributing editors like Jan Ozer and Robert Reinhart and Sean Lamb, as well as leading technology vendors in the industry. So we hope you can join us for as many of these sessions as possible. Before we kick off this session, though, I would like to thank our diamond sponsor, Limelight Networks, for sponsoring this week's events. And I would also like to thank Tulix, which is the company that is sponsoring the next hour's conversation. If you have any questions for our speakers, please enter them in the Q&A tab, and I will relay those to the speakers, or Jonathan, our moderator, will just grab them toward the end of the hour. This next session is one that I'm really looking forward to. News consumption grew by about 30% in 2020. Now, as we all know, 2020 was, I believe the word is unprecedented. I think I've heard that somewhere before. But it was a crazy year with COVID, with various natural disasters, with the election, with an impeachment in January, and then another one just recently. So it's been an insane year or so. And Jonathan Hurd from Altman Salon is going to talk about some research that he has done looking into news video consumption, and then open up a panel discussion to talk about it from various angles. So with that, I'll pass things over to Jonathan Hurd. Take it away, Jonathan.
Great. Thank you very much, Eric. I'd actually like to start by having the panelists introduce themselves. I'm just going to go on the screen I have here. Maybe Nino, you could start. You're on mute, though. Unmute, everyone unmute yourselves.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you for inviting. And I'm a business development, heading business development here at Tulix. Tulix is a fully managed streaming service provider with its own infrastructure, which makes the solutions flexible and then cost effective. Services include channel origination, 24/7 streaming, encoding, transcoding, CDN, security, monetization, and custom streaming solutions. We work with broadcasters, content owners, startups, and just about everybody who needs streaming. So this is about me and Tulix.
Excellent. Tony.
Yeah, hi, I'm Tony Brown. I'm Chief of Staff for Newsy. Newsy, for those who are unfamiliar, is an online news startup that in the last few years has turned into a television channel and is very widely distributed on OTT and connected television. My role as Chief of Staff is both to oversee our technology and its implementations throughout the entire business, but also to work on long-term strategy and put together strategic plans and develop the business as a whole.
Excellent. Sarah.
Hi, I'm Sarah Fisher. I am the media reporter for Axios, a new digital website that launched in the United States in 2017.
Great. And then Anne, you're on mute, don't forget, but
thank you. Yes, my name is Anne Galloway. I run a news website in Vermont called vtdigger.org. We are a statewide nonprofit news organization serving communities across the state, and our hallmark coverage is of the State House.
Excellent. And I will introduce myself as I bring up some slides to kick off the session. So I'm Jonathan Hurd, a partner at Altman Salon, and we are a strategy consulting firm focused on technology, media, and telecom, with about 300 people in Europe and North America. And we conduct research, self-funded research, as a way of showing our capabilities in the technology, media, telecom space. And but for us, research is a means to an end, which is strategy. But I pulled together a few slides from a survey that we conducted in summer of 2020. So some of this might be a little bit outdated, but it just shows that in many ways, the height of the pandemic, how people were thinking about news. And I'll focus on the news related slides. So one thing about, who watches news, who watches live news, it's really interesting and maybe not surprising though, that younger audiences are much less likely to watch the news than older audiences are. And you can see in the 55 plus, it's more than 80% of people say that they watch news at least monthly. And for younger people, it's only about half. There is some income skew as well, but not anywhere near as much as there is an age skew, and very, very little gender skew for the most part. But it just does show how at least watching live news, so that's video and live, is a relatively, varies a lot by age range. And we also asked, what was your primary source of news before the pandemic? And again, very striking age-related differences that under 25-year-olds, a significant number, around 30%, are actually getting their news from social media, among other forms of media as well. But the heavy impact of social media on news consumption is quite striking in those younger audiences. And also cable news being skewed to older audiences is pretty interesting as well. And so in terms of the impact of the pandemic, as Eric mentioned when he kicked off the session, we asked about change in time spent consuming news from all sources. And most respondents at all ages said that they were consuming more news than they were prior to the pandemic. Some people, like almost 20%, saying in the range of 6 hours more, and this is per week. So quite a bit more attention on news spent across all age ranges as a result of the pandemic. In terms of online news consumption, one of the things that we've seen in other surveys that we've done as well, but it's a bit surprising if this isn't something you've seen before, is the age-related skew in choosing paid versions of online news without ads. Most people at all age ranges prefer a free version of online news, but what's interesting is for the paid version, younger consumers are more likely to say that they would choose a paid version. Now, this is a very coarse way of looking at it. We do all kinds of price elasticity studies and everything, but the predisposition of younger audiences to paid more so than older is pretty interesting. And not surprisingly, there is a bit of a skew in income range as well in terms of preference for type of news. And then for people who are willing to pay for an online news subscription, what are the reasons? I was personally quite surprised that this desire to support or fund journalism was named by about a third of respondents, as well as a range of sources. And you have to go down a fair level to seeing, I don't want to see ads if there's a choice anyway, but my favorite news source does not allow free access was another reason. But perhaps there is some interest in supporting and funding journalism as a result of all the fake news that's out there. That may have driven a lot of people to select that top option. We also asked about trustworthiness of news sources and trustworthiness of ads. Huge age-related disparity here. In terms of very trustworthy, which was the top box selection in the survey, it's a minority of people across all age ranges and categories that think of the ads as being trustworthy. But it's interesting that younger consumers seem to be a bit more willing to call ads trustworthy versus older consumers who are much more jaded on the trustworthiness of ads, particularly on social media, where only 2% of those in the 55 plus range said that those were very trustworthy. And then this is the last slide, and I inserted it because I think it's important. It's kind of depressing to me personally, but we asked outright, if a news service were to add more racial diversity into its programming, both coverage and on-air reporters, how likely is it you would consider subscribing to it? And you can see the range is from much more likely to much less likely. And there were younger consumers were more likely than older consumers to say much more likely or more likely. But I was just surprised by the percentage of respondents that said less likely or much less likely. So, there are both age-driven and other segment-driven preferences for news. And we're going to talk now in the panel about some of those factors that affect news. And let's start out with 2020 impact. As Eric mentioned, there were all kinds of factors, political and pandemic, related to news. But what has been the impact for all of you of the pandemic on your business in terms of how you gathered news, viewership impact, and how did you adapt to that? Feel free to kick it off and make sure you're not on mute.
Right. I'll be happy to take that one off the top. News. I think you called it unprecedented at the beginning of the session here. I think our year has been also unprecedented. So in terms of the number of people who are seeking information, the way that we've had to report it, I mean, everything has changed. And as a small or smaller and growing brand, for us, we saw it really as a more level playing field against some of our bigger competitors. So, suddenly everyone was doing live television via Zoom and from home, and what you turned on TV was looked a lot like this. It was not necessarily coming from a tens of $1 million studio that have been put together in HD cams, but really, Logitech streaming cameras on top of computers on really bad internet and infrastructure. So for us, what we loved in that was that it allowed us to kind of show a lot more of the character of our brand. We feel that really resonated over the year, because a lot of people who tuned in just kind of maybe sampling Newsy and trying to figure out what we were or what we represented. We were able to hold on to a lot of that audience over the course of the year, especially as this news cycle has changed. So for us, it flipped everything on its head, but in a way that's been really beneficial and advantageous for us.
Anne, how about you?
Yeah, we had a very similar experience. The world was turned upside down. Our readership tripled over a period of about 3 months. And that was because I think our reporters responded very quickly to the kind of needs that our readers told us about. They wanted really granular information, local information about COVID. And we did our level best to supply them with that information, everything ranging from, unemployment rates to legislative changes, the CRF monies that came in addition to the public health problems that were generated by a lack of vaccine and so on over the course of the year. So our readership has kind of leveled off to about 750,000 uniques a month. That's huge for us since we're a state with 626,000 people. And we actually did much better with fundraising than we anticipated through membership and philanthropy and underwriting, despite the fact that there was a lot of uncertainty last year.
That's great. Congratulations. Nino, how about for you?
It was a very interesting year for us as well as for everybody else. And we, as a technology company, we always listen to our customers or new partners, what they needed. So we just quickly came up with some products like adding interactivity to the news stream, like a QR code, so that on the big screen when the news is consumed, that, you know, they can directly go to the websites or do donation or other things. And then also we, instead of like real-time conferences, we put together like virtual theaters for conferences with again the ticket purchase and whatnot. So all was on the fly. It was a kind of like, it's still going on, but you know, we are again thankful that opportunity gave us to develop those new ideas and new solutions.
That's great. And then Sarah, you both are in a news organization and you cover the news and other media as part of your reporting. How did it affect your day-to-day life? You're on mute, by the way, Sarah.
Thank you. That's such a great question. And thank you so much for hosting us today. It's a really great discussion, an important one. We were forced to work from home. I think everyone else here was. And so our video operations turned remote into our homes. Some of our podcast operations did as well. But I think the biggest impact that this had for us was that it really pushed a lot more companies that buy ads to focus more of their ads on the great things they do for the world, as opposed to just selling products. And that helped Axios because we have a really strong reach into decision makers and policymakers. And so people want to use Axios to reach those people with those messages. So at a time when the advertising market was very bleak for publishers that rely on advertising that sells stuff, it was actually pretty good for us because our ad business relies on publishers that want to share their story, ways they're helping out first responders, et cetera. But we weren't immune from some of the headwinds. Of course, a lot of different business ventures and things that we wanted to experiment with in the early days were put on hold. You know, we were pretty public, I think, about being conservative at the onset of the pandemic and making sure we weren't spending too much money because we didn't know how things were going to turn out. But moving forward, I'm excited that hopefully the ad market is expected to rebound in 2021, which won't just be good for us, but for all publishers.
Yeah, that's a great point, that even though viewership skyrocketed for a lot of streaming media, not just news, the ad dollars for many segments of many industries, travel, et cetera, were pummeled. So it was an interesting year of, I heard someone call it like empty viewership of, you know, just a lot more consumption, but maybe not the ad spending behind it. What about other topics from 2020? You know, political turmoil, racial injustice. Did those things, and I'll open it up to anybody here, affect what you decided to cover, how you ran your business? Tony, I see you about to speak.
Yeah, I mean, when we started 2020, our strategic planning was all focused on the election. And it was so interesting that, you know, mid-year, the election was probably the third biggest story of the year. That really just meant that our editorial teams and all of the planning that we did for the election, and even around, you know, the budgets that we had for studio sets and how we were going to cover election night across the country, had completely evaporated by that point, because we had already pulled and refocused our reporters on COVID and beats within COVID, and then we pulled reporters and we refocused on racial tension over the summer, and so by the time we got to the election, it was basically like we were just, you know, toward the end of a race, and it felt a little exhausting, I think, for our editorial teams. So viewership wise, you know, it all contributed. Last year was a huge year for news on so many different levels and for so many different reasons. I think it's going to be really interesting to see what happens next. But I guess that's what this panel is all about. We'll get to it.
Exactly. And for you, do those other topics affect Vermont coverage or viewership?
Well, absolutely. People in Vermont were extremely upset about the George Floyd killing, and there were many, many protests, and there were calls for accountability at the Burlington Police Department and for the Vermont State Police. And we were a bit of ahead of the curve because we had written a series of stories in the spring about excessive use of force. And so we had a lot of deep reporting under our belts on that particular issue. So we paid a lot of attention to that issue. And I agree with Tony that by the time the election came around, it was sort of like an afterthought, because we became so consumed with both the COVID reporting and the racial justice reporting that was so important to Vermonters. And yes, it all contributed to the viewership for sure.
Anyone else? Okay, I'll move on to consumer behavior. The slides I showed earlier, I'm curious what your thoughts are on anything that struck you about differences in age consumption, or how people consume news by age range, and particularly social media as a primary news source among about a third of younger consumers. What are your thoughts there? What trends are you seeing in your businesses?
I'll jump in. So obviously younger consumers are more likely to get news from social media. As you said, there's been a lot of data that backs that. But one of the misconceptions about young people is that, to the point that you made at the top of the presentation, that they're unwilling to pay for news, or that they're not engaged in traditional news, things like television or even radio and audio. What's really true is that young people are willing to pay for services that provide value to their life. Now, that includes streaming services that might include news. What they're not as willing to pay for is news directly. And the problem is that right now, news is not a value-added service for a lot of young people, the same way that a messaging app or a music streaming or media streaming app might be, like a Netflix or potentially Spotify. As they get older, that might change. The average subscriber to the New York Times, I believe, is around 40. And the New York Times, in order to extend their audience to be a little younger, their paid audience, they're creating opportunities for them to have more of a lifestyle service, the same way Spotify or Netflix would provide a lifestyle service. So they ventured into things like cooking and games. I think for young people, this is a more civically engaged audience and age group than we've ever seen in the past. They care about issues and they're deeply concerned and want them to be addressed. But the problem is, especially as we're going through, especially for millennials, probably their second financial crisis, they're going to be choosy about where they put their dollars. And it's going to have to provide something of value to their life. News can be of value to their life, but news producers need to create products that meet that demand. And right now, paying for a paywall to get a few news articles, that might not be meeting that demand head on.
I would agree with Sarah. It's interesting that what we are helping to put together new channels, and then it's very easy to put online now, right? So with the streaming technologies, and I saw that some news which are produced specifically for the younger audience are combination of the news and fun, and then the lifestyle, and so all this, and it's still a news channel. So I think there will be a new news channels which will be maybe more targeted to the millennials or whatnot. So, and maybe it will be more fun, and they will be more ready to subscribe to news that way.
Yeah, I guess Tony or Anne, anything that that you're doing to target younger consumers or change it, or do you think about your audience in that way?
We don't necessarily draw a distinction in terms of our target audience being, a certain demographic. We think of it more as a psychographic of people who are, open to, and I guess a less biased or partisan perspective that you normally find in a lot of TV news today. And so, but as far as behavior goes, we do see differences across the various platforms that we're on. And so, our viewership is younger on connected television because there just happen to be, more early adopters in younger demographics. So there are differences in the content strategies that we have between what we put on cable versus something that appears on connected TV. Slightly different tonality in the way that stuff is presented. We actually launched earlier this year a show called In the Loop, which is a digital only, it's a digital pure play of a show. And it's designed to be a little bit, I hate as a millennial saying this myself, but I hate, when I'm pandered to as a millennial, but it does tend to, present news a little bit more from a millennial's perspective, not like here's what millennials are doing, but here's what we're doing. This is what, this is news that's made for people who, look and are experiencing the world through this same lens. So that's a lot of how we're kind of viewing it.
Got it. So more tailored to the platform, and you might be picking up a different demographic on that platform than specifically targeting different age ranges. And anything age or demographic related other than Vermont residents that you focus on?
60% of our readers are under the age of 54. So we are skewing younger than we used to. We used to have a largely older audience, ironically, since we're a nonprofit and an online only organization. But I think mobile is becoming a bigger factor for us. And in a rural place, that's more difficult to achieve since, we do have mountains and sometimes it's difficult for people to get the signal. But 60% of our readers are accessing us on a mobile phone. So that's really shifted over the past 2 years. 3 years ago, that number was about 35%. So it's really changed quickly to accommodate people's habits. So,
wow, that's a big shift. And Nino, from a platform perspective globally or demographic perspective, what have you seen in terms of your customers and news trends?
What we see is that more and more news channels are popping up. They are not a cable news or whatnot, but they're putting together for different reasons. And we are supporting all of them. And what I like, they're very open-minded in terms of how easy to put new channels now. You don't need technically anything. You can put the studio in place like in a couple of days and start streaming. And then they push stream to the social media or whatnot and work on the audience. So worldwide news is a very important. They're following up. Of course, we all know that, but we see that like throughout the world. So we know that so any of those countries, there's an election, we see that traffic and usage is growing tremendously. And yeah, absolutely. That's a kind of like a trend, which is important. We see also the trend throughout all devices, mobile and then connected TVs like Roku and others. So that's what we're trying to make channels more interactive through the big screens as well. So mobiles are interactive one way or another, but big screens, it's harder to make interactive. But there's a ways to make. And then also like news channels are putting additional news channels, let's say English or Spanish or the multilingual ones. So.
Got it. Thanks. Some interesting innovations outside the U.S. where multiple languages, device interactivity around connected TVs is definitely an interesting challenge. Let's shift over to news content strategy. And how do you decide what categories to focus on and where to go light or deep? We've got local, national, and global news, and Then there's arts and lifestyle, science. How do you decide where to go deep versus to have more kind of light coverage?
I can take that one to start. I think it depends on your business model. If you are heavily reliant on programmatic advertising, which requires scale, you're going to want to produce content that is appealing to the masses. That's often parenting, lifestyle, entertainment, food, travel, and leisure. And obviously news and politics as well, but you need to write it from a very broad and general lens. If you're focused on selling subscriptions, you need to focus your content on whatever your audience is looking for. If it's a hyper niche subscription product, think about something like Business Insider, which focuses on business and technology, or any of these pros like Wall Street Journal Pro, Politico Pro, then you might want to focus on whatever subject matter people are paying a premium for, which could be news, finance, policy, etc. Then you also might have hybrid models where you need to cover broad-based topics for advertising dollars, but you also might have a niche subscription product. And so you might need to think about how your coverage area spans both of those things. I will say though, broadly speaking, there is two trends I've seen that have accelerated during the pandemic. One is that there's more of an appetite for people to pay for opinion content. And that might be why you're seeing outlets like the New York Times lean into opinion, hiring up opinion hosts and giving them podcasts. The other thing that you're seeing is that more publishers are recognizing that they can make money off of franchises. And so if you can develop a really strong reporter or story, you might be able to license the content to that story to a streaming company to make a TV film or to make a podcast out of it with a radio company. And so you might want to invest your story gathering into one or two key franchises that you can use to sell goods or sell rights. And then finally, there are some universal topics that we all know are a bigger deal now than they were prior to the pandemic. So e-commerce is much bigger now that we are transacting more online. Misinformation has become a huge topic for a lot of newsrooms. And we all have been hearing about these SolarWinds attack. National security and cybersecurity is only going to grow as a topic, as well as biotech because of this vaccine. These are things that a lot of newsrooms didn't always focus on as much. They were thinking about things like sports, weather, but now they're bigger topics for everyone to be considering.
Hey, Sarah, great points. And that middle point you made there around opinion and brands that you can extend to other platforms. Have you got any favorite examples there?
Well, the opinion one, definitely the New York Times. I mean, they hired people like Kara Swisher and Ezra Klein over at Vox. These are people with big opinion audiences, progressive audiences, and they're leaning into subscriptions. They also see their subscriptions drop if Bret Stephens, their conservative columnist, writes something that they don't like. So that's the best example on opinions. In brands, the conventional wisdom amongst media insiders is that Disney does this the best, right? They will create a Star Wars franchise, and all of a sudden you got a Star Wars theme park, you got a Star Wars resort. They're selling, literally, I have one right here. They're selling Baby Yodas all the time. That's how they're making money. But in the digital and news media world, there are a few examples of it. I mean, at Axios, our political reporter, Jonathan Swan, is known for covering like the insider beat of Washington, D.C. White House, the Trump White House. He has a new podcast that's focused on that specifically. He does stuff with our HBO show that's focused on that specifically. And so we have created all these different products around his specific reporting on the last days of the Trump White House. Other media companies that have been able to do this really well, BuzzFeed acquired this company called Tasty. And Tasty is like so viral on social media, but they also are doing a ton of stuff. They're selling actually kitchen gear in retail stores with the Tasty brand. So that's another good example of a publisher that's using a brand or a franchise to make tons of different money off of different stuff.
Yeah, those are great examples. And it shows that this kind of merchandising and brand extensions and taking a brand and monetizing it across multiple media or ways of consuming the brand, it can happen in news too. So I think those are great examples. What about speaking of brands and trustworthiness? You saw the results of trustworthiness in ads across different forms of media. what are your thoughts about trust in news and value of a brand? And, what are you doing to reinforce that with your readers or viewers? Tony, Ann, any thoughts there?
Yeah, our whole brand premise is based on trying to I guess present a refreshed view of what media and the news ought to be in this day and age, and kind of combat the hyper partisan I guess shift that we've seen over the last decade or so in television news. And you make the point about advertising, and it makes me think about earlier this year. We depend very heavily on programmatic advertising, and there's still a lot of folks who believe that equal time is kind of an established doctrine and still applies. And the thing with programmatic advertising is you're opening your doors, you're opening up your ad spots, but there really isn't a lot of control that you have over who fills those ad spots or how. And we got all kinds of feedback from viewers who were really unhappy with the fact that they might be seeing all ads from one candidate and not from another. And that's not necessarily a failing on our part. It's just that there are certain candidates that wanted to advertise in certain localities or to certain IP addresses, and those are showing up. And so that's an interesting thing that kind of trickled down then into how these folks are perceiving our brand, and really going against what we're saying on our air as being an anti-partisan news outlet, and really striving towards something that leaves that bias at the door.
That's a great point. And I was thinking about that when Sarah mentioned earlier about scale and programmatic, that being scale being critical for being able to sell programmatic, but there are some challenges in managing programmatic as well. And what are you seeing around trustworthiness, or either in your coverage or the brands that you work with?
Yeah, I think that because we fly pretty close to the ground, people give us a lot of feedback, and we pay attention to what people say. And, we want to make sure that our reports are fair and accurate, and we take a very nonpartisan approach to our reporting. And people know that, and they give us a hard time if we err. And we did get rid of our comments section, which was one of the best things we ever did. But we do take letters to the editor, which is important because we do want reader feedback. We also use tips quite a bit.
The feedback, we're getting a lot of echoing here. Oh, yeah.
So I was just going to say that our newsroom kind of lives on tips. We get suggestions from readers about what to write, and we don't take all of them, but many of the tips are quite accurate and lead us to stories that we might not otherwise pursue. And so that creates a connection with the audience that I think is really important. It builds trust, and we're also as transparent as we possibly can be, in terms of our finances as a nonprofit, and also in terms of, how we produce our news and how we report on ourselves and that sort of thing.
That's great. Nino, one of the things we talked about before was using technology as a differentiator. What have you seen in terms of how can a better technology platform allow a news publisher to differentiate?
I think that what is important now, and it's very easy to do pilots. Let's say if they have a multiple ideas they want to pursue, now technology will allow to do so. So you can try out, because you never know what you need to do for sure. So, like everybody, even Apple has a product which not successful. Not all products are successful. Same here. In my opinion, unless you try, you will never know for sure. Okay, we need to go this way or another way, try this direction, or make happy this population and another population. So in my opinion, what I'm saying is that just try out, have a pilot, and then with technology companies now with streaming, it's really not expensive at all. And then the statistics, and then give a try, so we'll show what direction to go, what will be. Sometimes you don't expect what can get very popular and then other things, so you think that will be, but really not. So it's like with movies and with everything else. So that's what I would suggest. Be creative.
I agree with that. Nino, I like your point about being experimentative, and for our team, it's really about just failing fast. We want to know if something's going to work really quickly, and if we do fail at something, we try to build our feedback loops so that we'll know right away, and we can either abandon that or change course really quickly. That's one of the things that I love about the news industry, is because we have a chance to do it again all the next day, and it just gives us an opportunity to really make a really robust feedback loop, because we listen to our viewer feedback very closely too, and people will write us when we have something wrong in a story, and we can make that correction. We can change it for a show later in the day, or simply make changes to our policy for the next day. So
Exactly.
It's, you got to build that feedback loop in.
Good. Let's talk about viewer acquisition, building your base and monetizing your base. So what have you seen in innovations in terms of what you've done to build your audience and or to monetize your audience?
I feel like it's a little hard to say with this last year, because in so many ways the audience has found us. But I think part of it is, especially as a news brand, trust comes over time. It's not something that you earn with an ad. It's really content driven. So our perspective has always been, sure, we need to run advertising. We need to make people aware of our brand. But end of the day, we have to deliver on that more than anything. And our long-term retention of viewers and audience will come from continuing to deliver on our promise as a brand. It's not just going to come from advertising spend.
Got it. So word of mouth is a key component then, Tony, for you?
Yeah, it's word of mouth. Word of mouth certainly helps, but it's even a little smaller than that, in that we're broadly distributed enough that we get plenty of sampling from people, and enough people who are either turning on a Roku for the very first time and seeing Newsy ads or Newsy the Newsy app there, and that audience is usually curious enough that they're gonna check it out at least once. So for us, it's yes, word of mouth, but it's really about just delivering on the promise and trying to create that connection one-on-one with people in a very sustained and long-term way.
Sarah, Ann, what have you seen in terms of subscriber acquisition or viewer acquisition methods and monetization?
Well, we have a lot of newsletter subscribers. Right now, our product is free, so we don't have to worry about how we're going to convert those people into paid subscribers. But we do have different types of subscriber acquisition strategies depending on the type of product. So for example, we have some newsletters that are really, really strong and have mass appeal. Axios Sports, for example, could appeal to many, many millions of people. Whereas Axios Media Trends, which is the newsletter that I write, probably only appeals to a smaller group of B2B professionals. And so the way that we're going to market my newsletter is very different than the way that we would market Axios Sports. My newsletter is very much on the ground word of mouth. The way I get the right people to subscribe is shaking hands with people at conferences pre-COVID and saying, hey, I write this newsletter. I think it could be really applicable to your daily media diet. Here's my business card. The sign up link is on the back. And so it was a lot of grassroots. The things I did, other than that, is I focused a lot on breaking news. Breaking news can be a really powerful tool to get exposure to people about your name and your brand, because if you break it, you're the only person that has it written, so they have to come to you. And that's a really great way to get people to sign up for the newsletter as well. And then the last thing I do is I do a lot of cross promotion within my company. So oftentimes if there's a topic that is really ripe for reporting on it with another subject matter expert, we'll do it together and I'll have them promote it in their newsletter. So you'll often see my name and my newsletter sign up link in other newsletters within Axios.
That's great. And it sounds like you didn't have to do a lot to promote readership over the past year, but what have you found to be effective, and how do you think about monetization?
Well, actually, early on, we did buy a Google ad promoting our Vermont COVID coverage. And so that did initially help us gain some SEO that we might not have otherwise had. We were also publishing dozens and dozens of stories about COVID over a short period of time. And so I think because most of the people came over the transom through SEO, that was an interesting experiment. And we were able to retain, as I said earlier, about 750,000 uniques a month. And we did monetize that group by asking people to make donations as members. We gave masks to hospitals for every donation that was made in the spring. And at the end of the year, we had a very successful drive in which we gave 10 meals to the Vermont Food Bank for every new member. And so over the course of the year, we were able to attract 10,000 members, and we raised more than $500,000 through membership over the course of the year. And so if you think about the funnel and you think about, who's at the top of it, it's all the folks who click once, and then, the loyalty builds hopefully from there. And we tried to capture as many people as we possibly could through email subscriptions. We were able to, go from 30,000 email subscribers to about 47,000 subscribers in a short period of time, in a couple of months. So all those things added together, kind of resulted in more money coming in the door to support our journalism, which was great.
Wow, that is great. And yeah, as a not-for-profit, you've got not only the economic considerations, but also the mission-related success factors that you're keeping an eye on. It sounds like you were able to achieve both last year. That's wonderful. There was we're getting near the end here, but I did see a question in the Q&A. And this may be for Nino, but in terms of live streaming online news, what efficiencies have been discovered over the pandemic in terms of costs? For anyone, really.
Yeah, like the way how we do, since we are a ground up streaming companies, like we are not a broadcaster, we don't supply traditional broadcast solutions, but in streaming solutions, it's technically just a matter of even hours. Like if you, what we discovered, many companies and the news are not news, but student news or other, they're getting a iPhone 12 using 5G and sending the signal straight to us, and we're providing playback. So technically, that can be done. I don't want to say like in a couple of hours, but really is that way. So and then they do have a website ready, and all they need to do put it so we will do recording for them as later on they can convert those content into the DVR materials or VOD materials, whatever you will call it. So it's amazing what technologies can do, especially with the news, and they can put whatever information, graphics or whatever on the fly, on their end or on our end, either way. So I don't know if I answered the question or not, but that's what we see.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. I saw another question come in. I'll paraphrase slightly, but Tony, you had brought up earlier that you try to take a nonpartisan approach to the news, but clearly we're in an environment where there's extremism in media and different news outlets trying to appeal to segments that might be at polar opposites of beliefs. This question is, will we ever find the middle in outlets for media reporting again? And we found it with Tony, but I'm curious more broadly, how do you all see news reporting in terms of extremism versus kind of more down the middle?
I should say that I don't know if we'll ever, find that that return to the middle, but I sure hope so, because we're putting a lot of our brand equity into it and our focus on it. But I do think that we're seeing some trends in the industry toward people who are searching for something that's a little less, I guess, partisan than what we see today. Some of that is anecdotal evidence that we get from as feedback from viewers and from our own studies that we've done in the market. But you can also look at the fact that CNN is beating Fox News, CNN and MSNBC. Although you could argue that they're also part of the partisan gang of cable television news, but they're beating Fox News again for the very first time in many, many years. So are we seeing a swing back? Are we seeing some stratification on certain ends of the spectrum? Hard to say, but I do think that there's quite a bit of white space there, and we're starting to see movement from various news organizations back toward what I would consider that middle.
Sarah, Ann, any thoughts there?
I think there's always going to be a bias towards wherever you make your money. And so going back to that New York Times example, they're going to be biased because most of their subscribers are left-leaning to be providing content potentially that meets that demand, which is why they've invested in some more progressive opinion coverage. But it also works the other way around. If you're really dependent on Facebook, for traffic, as was the case with many publishers, you pandered your coverage to their algorithm, which often rewarded outrage, shock, and emotional content. So you saw a lot of headlines around, obituaries and news of the day that was shocking. Now we're in a situation where people are starting to wonder, well, is there a way we can create a business model for publishers where they're not economically incentivized towards one political view or outrage? And one thing that a lot of publishers are starting to consider is becoming a 501c4, being a nonprofit. You saw yesterday that Alden Global Capital, which is a hedge fund based in Manhattan, acquired Tribune Company, which is the parent company to many major newspapers in the US, including the Chicago Tribune and others. And as a part of the agreement, they agreed to spin out the Baltimore Sun into a nonprofit. The Salt Lake Tribune has recently gone nonprofit, as did a bunch of New Jersey local papers last week. And so this is a model where I have a lot of excitement about, because when the profit does not need to be a multiple of revenue, as is demanded by venture-backed media companies, you have the freedom to focus a little bit less on pandering coverage to what can drive more revenue and just quite honestly focus on community. Now, I don't think that's the right fit for everybody. You need innovation in news. So it's not the one size fits all solution, but I think it's a really strong solution for a lot of big publishers that are trying to figure out what's the next step, especially ones at the local level.
Great, and Ann is a perfect example of that, and is also innovative. So that's great. Ann, what are your thoughts?
Well, I do think that the commercial model is on its way out, and that nonprofit is the way to go. And that's because there is a direct connection between the people you're serving and their support. And at the end of the day, what matters is the public service aspect of journalism. And to be honest, a lot of commercial outlets lost their way and weren't really serving the needs of communities. And as those newspapers got hollowed out, people recognized that and stopped subscribing. And meanwhile, ads went south. So in our case, we have a combination of revenue sources, including underwriting, which is the nonprofit form of advertising. And I do think that this model could work in other states and possibly for some national publications down the line. One of the issues that we all face as locals is that we are, in the end, competing with Google and Facebook, which have a model that is based on lots and lots of eyeballs as opposed to just a few. So, in Vermont, we have newspapers that have 3,000 to 5,000 subscribers. There's just no way to make that model work. You have to have a larger audience. So I do think that the hyper locals have to have enough critical mass to even make a nonprofit model work.
Right. Great point. Well, we are just about out of time, I'm told. And so let me just say thank you very much to all of you for doing such a great job and for doing the prep sessions ahead of time. It was a pleasure to do the panel with all of you. I'll turn it back to Eric.
Thank you so
Thank
much.
you.
And, following Sarah's cue, I have to bring Baby Yoda into the frame here. It's all merchandising now. At any rate, that was terrific. What a great discussion. Thanks again to all of you for joining, and thanks to our audience for joining as well. And one more time, I'd like to thank Tulix for sponsoring this session and Limelight Networks for sponsoring Streaming Media Connect this week. We will be back in just about a half an hour with a look at the complicated world of OTT ad tech.